Wild West Outlaws radio show presents a Western fiction storytelling. Read by Natural Reader. Dead of Winter Visitor, written by Daniel Bellei. This has been the worst snowy winter of all the years in these parts of the country. If you would been on the top of the cemetery hill, the view of Devil Rock Ridge below would have been mostly blinded of its visibility through the thick blowing snow. The town was practically locked down. It was hard to do any outside traveling, not anymore as trying to get from one place to another in town. The winds were intense with heavy snow drifts. In fact, the cold, harsh winter in the last month and a half had paid a toll for the owner, Mr. Pat McCoy, of the Undertaker parlor, as it had ailed him with a long illness in his old age. The Undertaker had passed on. Timothy Patton, a young lengthy blonde-haired man of 22, took it rough when he heard of his former boss' death. The Undertaker was buried next to Gregory Smith, better known as Kid Smith, who was his assistant he had hired, who was murdered a few years earlier. Pat McCoy helped Tim Patton in so many ways to better his life and brought him away from his former outlaw years. Timothy Patton was McCoy's assistant and grave digger. It was only a year ago when Patton left Mr. McCoy to go into his own business as a blacksmith, when he had purchased the up-for-sale shop attached to the livery stable in town. The new Undertaker that took over was a man in his early 40s, quite tall and a bit thin with black hair. He went by the name, Josh Coleman. Tim Patton did not much like the guy. It seems he illustrated a phony smile on his face, a false front to draw business, but behind the scene he was a cold person, not say the least, and Josh was only in it for the money. Josh was nothing like the man that Tim had worked for. The blacksmith was closed down for the day because of no clientele that was related to the weather conditions, so Tim Patton spent most of his time at his living quarters at the livery stable. Within an hour Tim noticed one rider coming into town as he stared out the window from his loft. It was hard to make out the fellow because of the weather visibility. The person seems to be wounded bad, as he was arching forward and swaying back and forth on his horse. Once he got closer, Tim saw that the man in due course slipped off his horse and landed deep into the snow about less than half a block from where he was. Timothy Patton came down the loft and opened one side of the large door slightly enough to get himself outside of the stable. Tim then saw the horse of the fallen victim heading towards the livery stable of where he was. He grabbed hold of the animal and brought it inside the stable and moved the horse into one of the empty stall. Patton noticed blood was all over the saddle and downwards, showing it was from the downed victim outside. Also there was a saddle bag full of money, giving the impression that the stranger was a bank robber just like he used to be a couple years ago. Patton decided to hide the money for the time being. After that, Timothy made his way out through the hard blowing snow to investigate further of the fallen victim. Dr. Steve Barnes across the street also saw the fellow come in and met Tim Patton in the street to be assistant. Other than that, the streets were completely deserted of any soul, and perhaps Tim Patton and Doc were the only persons that saw the stranger ride in. It was snowing hard and the wind was blowing wildly. By time the two got to the area, it was quite difficult to find the fallen victim, for the body was already buried deep in the snow. If it wasn't for the one hand that was still above the snowpack, they would have lost sight of the body's location. Tim took hold of the hand and yanked the body forward to the surface of the snow and whirled the body around with his face upwards. With the blowing snow it was hard to tell who he was, except he was motionless, looked young, and he was very bloody. Dr. Steve Barnes then came down on his knees and brought his head down to the victim's chest to listen for any vitals. There was a faint heart beating, that means he was still alive. Timothy Patton next dragged the body by the arm through the snow until he got the motionless stranger to the livery stable, and then they brought him inside. After that, Timothy Patton forced the motionless fellow over his shoulders and carried him up the ladder to the loft above. Tim next placed him down on his own cot. Doc began to strip the heavy wet clothing of the body and started on examining the fellow's condition. It was here when Tim Patton quickly learned who he was. Tim could not believe his eyes. It was his former partner and friend from the outlaw years, Clint Sickle. Clint would be the same age as he, which would be 22. Clint Sickle's appearance shows he had a mop of bushy brown hair and he was well built out, physically strong, but likewise not in this manner of being so muscular, sort of like Patton. Doc Barnes can see that Clint Sickle was coming out of consciousness, and making matters worse, he was burning up with a bad fever, but still he was nearly insensible of what is happening in his surroundings. Meanwhile, Tim Patton added more wood pieces to the burning wood stove to create more heat for the room. After Doc Steve Barnes removed the last pieces of the soaked bloody clothing, he noticed that Clint was shot, at least, 4 times. One of the bullets had badly wounded the young man more towards the left side of his ribs, about the center of his torso, just a few inches below his heart, and it went in deep. Doc went on to examine the other wounds and found a bullet wound below his left shoulder, which the slug had exited out his back part of his armpit. The third injury was just a fresh wound to the left arm, just about to the shoulder. The last bullet went straight through his far right side of his ribs, and it had exited out from the back end. Doc said to Tim, "Looked like he had lost a lot of blood. 4 gunshot wounds, and one of them remains in him deep. Don't think none of them slugs has hit any of the vitals organs though. However, I surprise he is still alive. I not sure if I can save his life, yet he is young and fairly strong of a fellow. Thus far I still have to dig out that slug, or he is a goner. I afraid I need to get started right away and get that bullet out of him before I lose him. He's already going back into unconsciousness. If he going to make it at all afterwards, he needs to stay a few more days to recuperate. This fellow needs a lot of rest to restore him back to health." While working on his patient, Doc Barnes asked Tim a question. "Seems you know this fellow, who is he?" Tim replied, "It's Clint Sickle. My old partner and good friend to me. We grew up in the same area and both of parents were ranchers, about half a mile apart. We used to hang out together almost everywhere that we went, mostly drinking and getting drunk. We were very young then and gotten ourselves into trouble. Even done some honest work on a cattle drive until we turned to outlawing. We done some bank jobs, cattle rustling, even horse thieving. We both served time in prison. Only thing is I went straight afterwards and he went his own way, continually his criminal lifestyle. I sure the law was after him and had shot him up. I positive he had some others with him and perhaps were killed by the lawmen. Even his younger brother by 3 years, Jim Boy, rode with him from time and time out. He looked so much like Clint Sickle, except Jim Boy was thinner and wore wire spectacles." Tim went on to say, "Doc, you need to be quiet about him being here. The town folks, especially that corrupted Sheriff, Peter Jackson, and his deputy thugs may cause some serious trouble. The law may be coming this way in search of Clint Sickle, maybe not today with this naughty winter weather, but they may be around tomorrow, or the next day." Dr. Steve Barnes responded to Timothy, "Don't worry Tim, I'm more concerned of saving your friend right now, and the only way that going to happen is keeping him hidden here in your care." Part 2. For 3 days Clint Sickle was kept hidden from the public, only to be seen by his friend and the doctor. Tim Patton was already back to work at his shop and occasionally through the day had check on his wounded friend's condition. Clint Sickle seems to be improving each day, but he still has a long ways to go, but for the most part he was out of danger of his serious wounded condition. Although the weather was bad outside, but it was still fair enough for travel on the 4th day. Tim feared the worst. 2 lawmen entered Devil Rock Ridge and made their first visit to the blacksmith shop. Of course they were looking for Clint Sickle. They were persisted that the outlaw was still alive and hiding here. Tim Patton was alone at the shop with the exception of his wounded friend, and the streets were quiet of people when the 2 lawmen were present. One lawman was Sheriff Pat Johnson and the other was a young deputy named Damian Myers from Deadwood. After much of Tim trying to convince them that Clint Sickle was not here, the 2 lawmen still was insisted to check the livery stable. It was Damian Myers who then recognized Tim Patton as one of the known outlaw. Sheriff was convinced that Tim was lying and perhaps was one of Clint Sickle's gang who was involved with the recent robbery. Damian Myers spelled it out for Tim. "Clint Sickle and his gang already dusted 4 of the posse before we killed 2 of his own boys and wounding him real bad as well. We somehow must had missed you there, Mr. Patton. Although Clint put up a good fight, we got his young 19-year-old brother, Jim Boy Sickle. He was shot up real good, and he died real nicely. Next we got the other one killed, a half-breed by the name of Johnny Snake Eye." Tim replied, "Well, I wasn't there, or was I involved? I went straight after I left prison." Sheriff Johnson responded, "Well, we may not prove you were there, but if you don't hand over Clint Sickle then we will take you back and have you hang in his place." Meanwhile Sheriff Pat Johnson forced Tim Patton to bring them into the stable at gunpoint. The sheriff knew Clint was here because his horse was seen in the stall. Johnson then ordered Damian to climb up the ladder to the loft and check if Clint Sickle was up there. While he was ordering Damian Myers what to do, Timothy Patton began slowly moving back, hoping to reach his gun behind his workbench. The sheriff caught on and commanded Tim to stay where he was. Clint Sickle heard what was going on below. Although Clint was still very weak, he forced himself up, brought out his revolver and waited to catch Damian Myers coming up. Tim below was not sure if Clint Sickle was well enough to take action. Then it happened. 2 shots were fired from Clint's gun and Damian Myers went flying off the ladder and fell to his death below. The bullets struck Damian Myers in his gut and heart. He was dead before he hit the floor. It gave some little time for Tim to reach for his gun and he manages to fire a shot into the sheriff. However, Sheriff Johnson returned fired about that same time and both went down together. The bullet went deep into Tim's mid-right ribs. Blood spewed out Tim's mouth and a gore of blood oozed out of his wound. Tim Patton went down hard and then into unconsciousness. The sheriff was killed instantly with a bullet to the heart. The excitement was too much for Clint Sickle's weak condition and he passed out above the loft. Dr. Steve Barn was the only person in town that heard the shots as he was already on his way to check on his patient. When Doc walked in the livery stable he discovered 3 bodies lying on the floor and Clint's arm hanging over the side of the loft above, thinking he was shot dead too. After further investigation he found that Tim Patton was seriously wounded but alive and Clint Sickle was unhurt. Soon after the incident Dr. Barnes attended to Tim's wound in order to save his life. In Tim's weak condition Patton made a deal with the doc before attempting to dig out the slug. However, making a long story short, Clint Sickle and Tim Patton manages to outsmart the law system by convincing Dr. Barnes to make up a different story of what happened and in return Tim Patton would share the reward money 3 ways if it was given. For the 2 dead lawmen Doc took the badges off of them and later told the local reporter to print the news that 2 remaining outlaws that had robbed the bank at Deadwood were hiding here in the livery stable and Tim Patton was held prisoner by them until Tim manages to take the criminals in a gun conflict. Tim Patton manages to kill 2 of them and at the same time got himself seriously wounded. Tim Patton also added his own words to the press that while being held prisoner by the 2 outlaws that they mentioned Clint Sickle, who was shot up bad in the ambush between the posse. He heard the 2 saying that Clint Sickle had died a half hour later along the fleeing trail and they had buried him in the wilderness. Later Timothy Patton had received a $5,000 reward, plus the stolen money found with the falsely assumed dead outlaws was returned to the bank. In other words, Clint Sickle faked his death and Tim Patton manages to get out of being suspected in the robbery. Although Tim Patton was not involved at all with the bank job, he helped Clint Sickle out of his deadly troubles and kept him under wraps. 6 days later, Tim Patton looked at Clint Sickle and said, "It is time you need to go straight, Clint, and here is your opportunity to do so. Many folks think you are dead, let's just keep it that way and start over with a new life." Clint replied, "Oh heck, I am tired of being on the run, perhaps it is time to change." It was Christmas Day and it was a beautiful day out, a day for celebration of friendship, plus being very rich, they both and Dr. Barnes share the reward money. When the 2 boys looked over the loft they saw something so pleasing. Someone set up a 15-foot Christmas tree in the middle of the stable, decked out and with 10,000 lighted candles. Both boys stared at each other and both said at the same time, "Oh my God, hope the place don't catch on fire and burn down to the ground." Then the boys shouted, "Merry Christmas to all." The end. Story by Daniel Bellei. Narrated by Natural Reader.